Morning. How's everybody? And thank you, Doug, for getting me here. And John Kamak, also from our advisory board, is here. Raise your hand, John. And so we'll get started. Oh my God, is this a dentistry conference? Okay, actually, all right. So I know what this is about, and I was trying to fix this. Now stay with me. I was trying to fix this a couple nights ago, and I realized there was a much larger problem of dents, and so it needed repair. All right, back to earth. And so what we're going to talk about today is putting a dent in the current way of thinking about violence. Just kind of shoot it in there. And what I'm going to do is talk about treating violence like a contagious disease, which is not the usual way of thinking about it. And this is kind of the course that I've been taking for a while, which is transferring some of the methods that I learned overseas into a new field of work. And what we're going to talk about is how this is contagious and how treating it as such is bringing strong results. And actually, we've had 3 independent evaluations, and we're in 15 cities and about 10 countries. And the organization behind it is now listed as the 9th best NGO in the world by the Global Journal. My course is, I'm a standard, just straight medicine doctor who got trained in infectious diseases at San Francisco General and UCSF, and I went overseas, first to Somalia, and this was my kind of where I really cut my teeth. We had 6 doctors for 1 million refugees in 40 camps and needed to reduce the spread of diarrheal diseases and respiratory diseases and also tuberculosis, which is what I'd been working on in San Francisco. And I spent 3 years there and then 7 more years abroad with the World Health Organization with the AIDS program. So I was learning how to reduce spread in these problems and in a cholera epidemic. And then I was learning about behavior with World Health with the AIDS epidemic, sexual behavior. Sexual behavior, violent behavior, exercise behavior, eating behavior, they're just behaviors to people who are coming from the health world. And I worked on the Uganda program, which was the first and for many years the only program that had changed its sexual behavior for, in a way, the whole country, and done a total reversal of this epidemic. So that's me on your far left, and this is me ready to leave. And I came back to the US a little over 15 years ago, really not knowing what to do. I just kind of wanted to take a break from all of this work in Central Africa and East Africa and so on. And people started to tell me about this problem of children shooting each other and having to go to each other's funerals and things like this. And this didn't make a lot of sense to me that this was going on. I was very far removed from this problem and also very far removed from America and the way that America was thinking and doing things. And so I began to just simply ask questions. Remember, I had no idea what I would work on because there really weren't problems in the US that I had. In fact, I was aware that, that people had water that went right to their houses. How many of you have this? And even more than one room. And so I really didn't know how to relate to America and had actually a lot of problems adjusting. But I began to ask questions about this particular problem, and I got this particular answer as one of the things that people were doing about it, that is to say punishing and telling people that they really mean it. And we're going to really teach these people a lesson. Then there's this whole other set of problems, which I call everything, that was also being discussed. And so these two matters, and I had seen these kinds of explanations for issues having to do, not exactly the same set, but with diarrheal diseases, the water and the sanitation and the poverty and the crowding, and the same thing with TB. But we had learned very specific ways of going about it. And that would get 50 to 85% drops. So to me, there was a kind of gap here in the way that this was being looked at. I didn't realize immediately what we would do, but I was also looking at these maps and seeing this very characteristic clustering of murders and of shootings which is characteristic of epidemic processes. And then this was the US curve, which is also an epidemic curve. All epidemic curves consist of multiple curves, curves upon curves. And so it was starting to leak into my mind that this was possibly an infectious problem, which reminded me of old infectious problems that we had dealt with centuries ago. And this is a slide of plague, which, if this would strike a memory to you, since you were around 400 or 500 years ago, I'm sure, that we didn't know what to do about these problems. And people were dying, and we didn't want to go into these neighborhoods. And in fact, we were blaming people. And why was all of that? It was because we didn't know what was going on. Why? Is because there were invisible microorganisms of which we knew nothing about. And the similarity is that there's invisible processes going on in the brain that also guide our behaviors, that mold them, and also that can be used to change them. But since plague, for example, was due to an invisible microorganism inside a flea, inside a rat, nobody knew. But when this got uncovered, really in the late 1800s, we then were able to stop using dungeon solutions and dragging people around the moat and things like that, and apply science and develop a whole new set of strategies that would put this into the past. And many of these problems, which are not problems in your daily life, most likely, went into the past because of the application of science and the ability to develop entirely new strategies that were based on the underlying science of how transmission was occurring. And they kind of boiled down to these things: early detection and prevention of transmission, case finding treatment, new categories of workers, outreach workers, case workers. We now have people who look for early cases of bird flu or SARS and so on. And then invisible disease control systems, which now keep us free of TB and plague and other things, which still do emerge. And so these went into the past because of science, not because of any moralistic solution, which was the common way of looking at these problems, which is largely the common way of looking at violence today. In fact, health problems. So I just want to quickly go through the dictionary definition of contagious, both the medical and lay dictionary, which is very straightforward. It just means that one event leads to another. It's capable of being transmitted. And now there's dozens of studies that show that the number one predictor of a violent event, and many of the people know this from their common experience, is a preceding event. So whether it's a retaliation or a gang war, or in fact war, or in fact even knock down our World Trade Centers, guess what we'll do? I mean, so one event leads to another, leads to another. And this happens on the street, it happens in the home. So this is the same as, but it doesn't happen every time, of course, nor would every person exposed to flu or to a cold or TB in this room get the flu or a cold or TB, because there's resistant factors and there's dose response factors and there's latencies and incubation periods and things like that. Nevertheless, without it, it doesn't occur. However, if you're sitting next to someone who has a stroke or has diabetes, this is not transmitted. Exposure does not cause. And this is the principal differentiation between things that are infectious, whether they have a microorganism or not, whether they lead to more of themselves. So colds and TB works this way as does violence. And this is a nearly definitive study on the left, and it's one of the only ones I'll show that have anything that look like this. I know there's a bias against looking at these sometimes in fun meetings, but on the left is African American, poverty, crowding, housing project, unemployment, totally dysfunctional families, but the children did not have exposure to violence by witnessing or having been victimized. And on the right is the exact same housing projects, et cetera, et cetera. However, there was high exposure, that is to say they had directly observed, witnessed, or had been victimized. And there was, this is the difference. And exposure is the, in fact, risk factor for it. Violence causes violence. And in fact, it's even dose responsive, as is flu, as is TB. Sticking with the biological framing, capable of being transmitted. And it also meets the dictionary definition of a disease, and it has a characteristic set of signs and symptoms causing morbidity and mortality, meaning physical or mental injury or death. Now, there's 3 population characteristics of any contagious disease, or you could say even contagious process, and that is clustering, transmission, and so let me just go through these quickly. Here is a clustering of a characteristic. This is a cholera, an endemic situation of epidemic cholera, multiple foci, and similarly violence. And what I love this next set of slides, which has to do with this is the usual standard, and there's different types of epidemic curves. There's what I showed you before is more person to person, and this goes into the science of epidemiology. But there's also something called point source, where it starts in one place and then spreads all over. And they may have secondary waves. Now here's a standard infectious disease curve. It's going on its own a little bit. I'm really in trouble when my Pandora starts to go on its own when I'm giving a talk. Anyway, this is a cholera epidemic that I was involved with. And you see the number of cases rapidly, and a secondary wave. Why would you have a secondary wave? New group of susceptibles, newly exposed. And these were new refugees coming into this one particular camp who had not been exposed, and then they became exposed later. So forget the reason and the explanation that I just told you. If you just look dispassionately at this set of curves, and here's a point source epidemic of violence. This is in Rwanda. This is a very well-known, goes by the name of genocide, but to epidemiologists, it's just violence epidemic. And then there's a second wave, and the political reasons, or the reasons, the humans have reasons for this, is that people who were hiding were subsequently found. So it's a new group of susceptibles, newly exposed. Same patterns, something invisible going on, keeping this going. And then transmission, which I began to touch on, which has to do with spread. Transmission just means spread. And here we have the spread of violence in the UK, 24 cities in 2 weeks. And this is a famous violence epidemic known to non-epidemiologists as World War I. Spread. 4 years later, 15 to 20 million people dead, not actually predicted by the singular political event happening in one place at one time. Now, just to add in, but I won't have time to really go through this, is that there are syndromes that actually have cross-transmission. So if you're exposed to violence in your community, you're more likely to do violence in your family and more likely to actually commit suicide. And similarly, this also occurs in the context of war. And people who are exposed to war are more likely to do violence in their family and in their community, not just to their quote-unquote enemies. And there's a few things for me to just pause on here that have to do with thinking about transmission. So just think about a child who has been, I think there's like a timer on this or something too. A child who has been exposed to violence has a 30% chance of doing child abuse to his own child. Now, this makes no sense in the world of reasons, because you would know how bad it was for me to have that have happened. Why would I do that to my own child? Do you follow me? So something was transmitted through the brain. And likewise, Israeli children exposed to Palestinian violence, Palestinian children exposed to Israeli violence, are more likely, yes, to be involved in violence against their quote-unquote, as we would call it, enemy, but they also are more likely to do violence in their own community. These are 14 to 17-year-olds. And in their own home to their own girlfriend or spouse. So why would you do that? It makes no sense in the world of reasons, except that something was transmitted. And this is very interesting, and it caused me to freeze for a while in a book that I've been writing for all too long about trying to figure out what's really going on here. And it turns out that there is a lot of scientific literature showing the means of transmission and how brain processes. And so whereas TB is taken in through the lungs and then is processed by the lungs to produce more of it. It doesn't kill the lungs. Lung processes it. Cholera is swallowed. It doesn't kill the intestine. It just, the intestine has a particular way of processing it to put out more of it. It actually poisons a pump temporarily. Similarly, this observing and witnessing is the way in. And there's processing mechanisms that we now know or are speculating or are learning about. And they have to do with, first, copying itself, which Bandura first learned about, or social modeling, which is copying or imitation. Then which is, of course, contagious. Copying is, of course, nothing but contagious nature. And then the business of wanting and anticipating reward from friend, which is dopamine mediated, and avoiding the isolation of your friend network, which pain center lights up under. And then there's limbic processes that accelerate trauma. And so this is all reviewed in a chapter of the Institute of Medicine workshop called Violence is a Contagious Disease that I wrote that came out last year. But I want to show you what this means because it raises the fundamental question of how our behaviors really formed. How many of you have really asked the question, where did my behaviors come from? How come I'm like using forks instead of chopsticks? Or how come I'm dressed like this instead of in kilts? You know, where does behavior ordinarily come from? And this is the principal mode of the acquisition of behavior, as it turns out. And certain behaviors that are highly salient and really important and highly memorable and that really stick in your mind, like violence, are more modeled and more copied and more imitated than that. And then that's like the initial acquisition. And then it moves on to doing what you think your friends expect of you. And this is totally invisible. And it becomes downloaded, and it's what we call social expectations. And this is the stuff that dopamine mediates, just as it mediates sex and the anticipation of sex and the anticipation of food. This pathway is used for anticipation of social reward. Because believe me, do these kids really want to fight? No, this is what's expected of them. And this is the others that's expected of them to watch, just like it's expected of you to sit in your chair comfortably and not standing up and dancing and so on. And nobody's smoking in this room. There's a social expectation that we don't do that anymore. But when I was in medical school, a third of us were smoking when we were watching angiograms. And so there was a social expectation that is shifted, and people aren't thinking about it. And it has something to do even with how I've dressed today. So, and then if you add on to that the trauma, and then what you get is exposure, the accumulation, the contagious nature, epidemic curves to us. And then, fortunately, we know how to reverse and interrupt epidemics, and there's a whole science to this, too. There's overlapping sciences. There's sciences to how to set up the infrastructure and detection and interruption, and how to do, then to find the next people who might spread, and then to change the overall community norm. And then there's a social psych into how to do persuasion and behavior change and shifting norms, which we in health are doing and are learning to do more and more, and which we're applying here. So the interruption of transmission simply means, it's preventing one event from leading to another. And we do this in TB by finding the people who are most infectious and treating them. And we do this in reducing violence by a new category of worker called the violence interrupter, who can detect events that might be happening because someone's angry at someone slept with somebody's girlfriend, or looked at their girlfriend, or disrespected them, or a friend was shot, or something like this, all of the usual reasons in the neighborhood. And then our workers, because of their credibility and trust and access, and because of how they're trained, have been evaluated to be 100% effective at preventing retaliations, even in the event of a murder. And so there's a new category of worker, which I'll show you. And then there's another group. They may not want to shoot tonight or tomorrow, but they're in the very, very high risk by epidemiologic and social network categories of likely to transmit next. And to diseased people like myself, they're like the people who have abnormal x-rays for TB, So they're not transmitting yet, but they might. And here there are people who are hanging around with the same group. They haven't been provoked yet, but they're next. And they need to have a new category of worker who is an outreach worker doing the behavior change part of this. And so then we have interruption of events likely now, and if there's already been transmission, preventing subsequent events. And this becomes part of a system that, as it rolls out, turns into transmission being blocked as a result of group immunity and new norms. And so what it looks like is we do mapping just as we do for TB or cholera or anything else. Detection and interruption. So very important who the workers are. For those of you who are thinking about the application of this to other things, like corruption or to cyber theft and things like that, it's a particular type of worker that's required to interact with those who are doing it. And this is a little bit of brain science of ensuring that we're all in the same us group and that there's credibility and trust. And then they, in this particular setting, have learned the special skills of cooling people down and buying time, and then reframing. And reframing is a big thing in shifting a behavior. So they will talk to them about their kids or about their grandmother or about other things of this nature. And then there's behavior change agents who work for longer term, for 6 months to 2 years with the high-risk guys to shift them. The workers are also have the same access, trust, credibility profile, but in addition, they have to work more on new models and on new sets of behaviors and new rewards and new sets of skills. And so there's an intensive training curriculum on this. And then there's a lot of work having to do with changing norms that begins to change expectations using many different messengers, a behavior change campaign, all with the same message, and that becomes a diffusion of innovation thing. So this is a system, this is an epidemic control system, and it's been getting results now in 3 independent evaluations. In the year 2000 was the first time that we put this system into a neighborhood. It was actually only part of the system at that time. And we got a 67% drop in shootings and killings in the first year in what was the worst police district in the United States at that time. And our funder said, oh yeah, sure, do it again. And we got 45% drop in the next 4 communities. And this is one of them, showing shootings per month. And you can see the drop. And then there's a second drop when we were able to double the program. And this has maintained itself. The first was in an African-American community, and this is in a Puerto Rican-American community. So these are quickly all the way on the left are the average of the mean of 6 communities. It's not 1 community and 3 others. It's 6 communities and 3 sets of controls. And it's statistical at the 0.01 level in terms of comparison rates, neighborhood, contiguous neighborhood, and city as a whole. And these are the next 8 communities all the way on the left, and then the next 4. And these are from independent evaluations showing before and afters of hotspot mapping. The first independent evaluation of this was a 7-year study with 10 years baseline, 4 universities, 4 different types of methods, Department of Justice funded, 5 communities with 100% drop in murders after a murder in terms of retaliations. And this is the summary. Our website has links to these studies. The second set of independent evaluations was done by Johns Hopkins in Baltimore, CDC funded, 30 to 50% drops in shootings and killings, and all kinds of other behavior change parameters and norm change showing up, relationships between interruptions and drops. And now we're starting to see results from other places that we're working in Latin America and in Africa. We actually have tweaked this model with the use of technology, working with Ushahidi and Medic Mobile and some others on the Kenya, for the last Kenya election. And we've been working in Iraq and Basra for about 5 years and doing some training in Syria, and there's a few other places in that region where we're working. So this is, the science of this is kind of summarized by the Institute of Medicine. we're getting more and more international and national kind of attention to this idea, including New York Times cover story. The Economist called this approach that'll come to prominence. A movie was made of this. These are the cities that it's being applied in. So we're looking at this problem as one that was stuck. And many of these other problems, I learned this at World Health when I was running their intervention unit. We did a summary of many different problems. And it was one of the two big things that I really learned that knocked me over, is that fields gets completely stuck. Malaria got stuck. And diarrheal diseases got stuck. Family planning got stuck. Some of these problems get stuck for 20 or 40 years. Some of them arguably for the history of man. And I think that that's really what's happened here. And it's the science that allows us to look at it more. So what this begins to reveal is a kind of medieval way of looking at this. When I'm doing this slide right, the script on the left is kind of this archaic medieval script. I'm showing this old view of this problem and this modern view of this as a contagious behavior. This is very solid now that this is contagious behavior. And it's also very solid that it really does not appear in the absence of exposure. This provides a new language to us, which opens up several dents in our universe, our world. This is, you make up your own mind by looking at the definition, but it meets all of the criteria. Medical. It also, by the way, the Centers for Disease Control has a Center for Violence Prevention. World Health Organization has a division for violence prevention. This stuff, by the way, lands in hospitals, requires intensive care units, emergency rooms, and so on. It's more than a metaphor. This is solid. There have been 20 replications of this, 3 independent evaluations. The approach has actually been endorsed by the U.S. Conference of Mayors. We're in demand from the Inter-American Development Bank, the World Bank, USAID to work on this in other countries. And so these are the spaces that Cure Violence and our board is really focused on in terms of the next several years. You can see we've started. We are looking for partnering ways to extend depth and reach. So this allows us the possibility of getting this into the past, but it does require a different way of thinking, not just the application of the method. So we're kind of shooting this through a dent. And there's at least 3 other things that we're nearly ready to say we can put into the past. The ideas of bad people and these other ideas, including punishment. So I'll stop there, and thank you very, very much. Thank you.
Sure, go for it.
So I'm really curious if you think this can be applied to rape, because that's one of the biggest cultural epidemics we are facing.
Yeah, I would say, with all humility, and yes, well, first off, it is a contagious process. You can do the epidemiology of it, but especially if you look at it, for example, in the setting of Central African Republic now, or Bangui, these places. I mean, it was not there anywhere to this degree. It emerged, and so what is required is some people who have access and trust and credibility to be identified as interrupters. Does that make sense to you? Yeah. And if we choose the right people, they do not put themselves at danger. They just begin to question and cool things down. But and let me just say this, there isn't anything that we're doing here. There's some things that we're doing better and something that we're applying science more to that I didn't take from other areas of work. We've just connected dots. We've connected epidemiology, infectious diseases, and behavioral sciences. So I know there's many other problems because this is a transferring of methods. Yeah.
I have one question too. Can this also be applied to seeing media as well? Does the same thing happen to the brain if you see violence, then you
Yeah, there's something to, the question has to do with the media exposure to violence. So exposure to violence in the media is negative. It is harmful. It is not as powerful as seeing it in a real context. A lot of people are able to interpret it. It does lead to less empathy and more aggression for several hours. So there are people in this field, and I'm not sure if I'm really in this field or not, but there are people who believe that it has more powerful of an effect than I'm saying.
So
Okay.
in your charts, for example, would it be the intermediate? You had the one where it was like high exposure.
No, that was about direct. That was about
That's
direct
direct
exposure. That means that
exposure.
you observed events
Yeah.
or you were victimized, and it's even a question of
So
whether
that's about
victimized.
frequency.
Yeah, it's frequency, and there's something about intensity.
Okay.
There's the same thing having to do with TB or flu. These are dose dependent. It's frequency and amount.
Sure.
And this stuff is the kinetics of this with other infectious diseases, especially with flu, has really been worked out. Yeah.
Cool. Well, let's do one more right
Yeah.
now, and then he'll be around for and we can chat afterwards. So you pick, Gary, which one?
Well, I'm looking at you. Yeah.
So Mother Jones published an article several months ago on the research that's been going on internationally around lead exposure and the changes to young brains that predispose them to more violent behavior, and how we see clusters around areas where there was a lot of automobiles spewing lead, and how after lead was phased out in countries, they've seen reductions of violence. Do you think that there's some, in the clustering you're seeing there, do you see any parallels between that research with lead as kind of
Yeah, I know your question. I mean, lead may be another kind of what we would call cofactor, or modulating or mediating factor that does have impact as well. But the same thing is true for these other things. That for these other problems, that there's other factors that cause additional propensity. But if you look at these if you look at like what's happening in Syria now, or you look at what's happening in various neighborhoods in Oakland or New Orleans, you're not seeing outbreaks of lead. So it's relevant, but it's not the high variable. Yeah.
Cool. Well, thank you, Gary.
Yeah. Thanks very much.